You are listening to Talking Star Wars.
Hello, this is Alex and Connor here, and today we would like to talk
About Star Wars.
About Star Wars, yeah, as usual.
Yeah.
So, our focus today is on, in Star Wars, the Force is this all-connecting energy field that connects all living things, and even it's non-living things. It's more like the background voice of the universe, and it expresses itself in many different ways. And the Jedi and the Sith do not have a monopoly on understanding, utilizing, and having even a mythos about the Force.
Yeah, it's not a single religion or set of opposing religions. It is this living sphere that has, in some Star Wars canon, scientific means, scientific bounds, if we talk about midichlorians, but I think that's all we needed to mention about midichlorians in the Star Wars podcast.
Well, I think you can understand that there are ways in which you can study this in a scientific way, but that it is ultimately a mystical force, but that it exhibits physical, recognizable energy and power in the universe through things like kyber crystals and time travel, even the manipulation of objects, the midichlorians and people. So we don't need to go into dissecting how Qui-Gon's explanation of how he believes the Force works is likely not entirely true, but it is how Qui-Gon conceptualized it, which is an interesting way of putting it.
And how George Lucas does. Just know that is his insert character in the universe.
Yeah.
But do you want to jump into the light side or dark side first, as far as the spectrum of Force users?
Well, let's talk about the light side first, just because they're usually our protagonists, and also often a little more straightforward, though not always. And then we'll go into the dark side, and then we'll talk about those people who sort of exist in the margins in between.
Yeah, they're guardians of the peace, the Jedi. They're trying to protect the galaxy, and the major dramatic arc that we get, narratively speaking, is in the Clone Wars cartoon, where we see them militarized into these war generals. And that show beautifully depicted how that caused them to sort of bend past their more philosophical leaning of trying to protect and guard life. They're turning into warmongers.
Yeah, warriors and soldiers, which I certainly ascribe to the philosophical belief that often, to protect freedom and liberty and all that, violence is a necessary tool. And the Jedi agree. I mean, they carry lightsabers and practice with them and all those deadly weapons. They're more like warrior Buddhist monks, if you're going to look at a historical thing. With them, like, they might take many kinds of vows of, maybe perhaps poverty and non-attachment, but they do not take vows of non-violence. In fact, they recognize that the universe is a violent place, and that employing violence, even if as a last resort, can be necessary to combat evil.
Against the scum and villainy, as Obi-Wan says.
Yeah, and so I think, the Jedi have existed for thousands of years. They're our primary example of the light side of the Force, or even just maybe the Force in general. By the time we meet them in the prequel trilogy, which is the earliest, other than the High Republic series, which we'll get into later as its own sort of area.
Because it'll be developed, it's been developed in books and comics, but it's going to get its own miniseries as well in Star Wars Acolyte.
Yeah, so once we get a complete image of this whole High Republic series, we might talk about the Jedi there. But by the time we meet them, the earliest is the prequel trilogy and the Clone Wars. They are an institution. They are one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy, despite being, 10,000 a number we say, and that's far fewer than even our planets in the Republic. So, having the ability to use the Force is rare. There is such an establishment that people willingly have their children be sent to the Jedi Temple, and it's considered an honor. We never see any pushback from children that are like hidden away from the Jedi.
And sending them there might be sugarcoating it, because they give them to the Jedi. It's like, here is my infant. I will never see this infant again. The parents have as little attachment to their children as the children will once they learn the ways of the Force.
Yeah. As we'll get into later, Count Dooku's fall is that he does maintain contact with some of his family. He is a relatively late... early in his childhood makes contact again with his family after not remembering them, and so then he cultivates this late family connection that he's not supposed to. So yeah, the Jedi have a very strict set of rules, and it is fairly obvious that this set of rules has been codified over generations and generations of Jedi to prevent Jedi from falling to the dark side. The Jedi recognize that we have a rare power, and it is incredibly dangerous when misused. To quote Ahsoka from The Mandalorian, "I have seen what happens when the best of us falls, and I will never risk that again." And we consider the havoc that two dark-side users, Palpatine and Vader, were able to wreak on an entire galaxy.
For years or decades.
I do not necessarily agree or think that the Jedi had the best path. And I think a lot of their policies failed, but you can see, as in any good setting, why all of these policies and traditions and philosophies were created. So they have a sensation of non-attachment. Children are raised from a very young age not to know their families. So there's the only family they know is the Order. They must be willing to let go and even sacrifice their associates at any time if necessary. And largely, they're supposed to be detached from politics, though I think by the time we see them in the prequels, they have already become a political institution.
They're a tool of the state.
They've deliberately placed themselves as the servants of the Republic, which is a specific political apparatus that rules the core of the galaxy, but it is certainly not the only political entity. But the Jedi serve the will of the Republic, which often comes into conflict. So they've already become a political institution.
Yeah, it's. I'm thinking even before the Clone Wars. I know that Anakin, of course, is personally involved with Padme, but they're just called to be bodyguards for Padme when she arrives on Coruscant at the beginning of Attack of the Clones. And it's like, don't you have soldiers? Don't you have your own bodyguards, bounty hunters? No, we're just gonna call our warrior monks in to protect our politician.
Yeah, it was a political tool being used by Palpatine to, potentially show someone favor. And really what he wanted to do was use it as a stepping stone to kick off the Clone Wars by foiling Newt Gunray's plan to assassinate Padme through 7 cutouts. But he's like, well, I'll assign Obi-Wan. He'll get to the end of it. He'll discover the Clone Army. Actually, he discovered a little faster than I thought he would. But this is one of my triggers. I need to trigger the Clone War. Because Dooku is about to ink this deal with the Separatists, and the Republic doesn't have an army, and I need a war to start. I can't just... It doesn't really matter to me who wins, but I need a long, bloody war to start eroding the institutions of the Republic that I want to turn into my empire.
Start to carve the Jedi numbers down to fewer and fewer. And the Clone Wars does a fantastic job in showing Pong Krell and other Jedi who were similarly disillusioned by the Jedi Order, setting up Anakin's eventual fall. Star Wars is not just a set of films, it is this entire epic. It's this entire canon of shows and media that build
books and things. Yeah, so we have the Jedi as this institution. Largely, they're portrayed as they're pretty cool. They're force of good. They got the lightsabers. They have the force powers. They are committed to the betterment of others and the sacrifice of the self. And largely, we see Jedi living up to that. Though, by the time of the prequel, we also see, they're not like the robots. They also have personal preferences. They make wrong decisions. So I also think it's a positive way if they have the access to this power and they have a certain code that they follow to avoid falling to the dark side. But within that, there's still a lot of wiggle room. I mean, you have Mace Windu, who is a fairly severe and uncompromising individual, a powerful warrior in general, but is not willing to give people second chances. Tempered more by Yoda's more forgiving attitude.
Yeah.
But Yoda is the one who eventually agrees to train Anakin Skywalker, and that results in the downfall of the Republic. Whereas if they had followed Mace Windu and not trained him, perhaps things would have gone differently. So even sometimes the Jedi's best intentions, I think straight up the New Republic doesn't incorporate Luke's new Jedi Temple into their political hierarchy whatsoever.
I was going to bring that up just based on the little that we've seen in the space between the original and sequel trilogy. We know that there's a second downfall of the Jedi Order, but there is no real hint at their connection with the New Republic.
Yeah. So there is one significant novel set 5 years before The Force Awakens. It's called Bloodline. Leia is the primary character, and we see a lot of political machinations going on in the New Republic, and she is in communication with Luke, who is engaging in Force training with her son, who's a teenager at that point, but there's no mention of, Luke is a hero of the rebellion, but that is more important politically than his status as a Jedi.
Sure.
So deliberately, the New Republic does not place Jedi, again, despite them being few in number, in any kind of political or officially sanctioned position, because it did not go well last time.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's not just a Sith who caused the downfall of the Jedi Order and the Republic, but it was a fallen Jedi. So, again, putting your faith in this powerful Ubermensch order might not be the best. So,
Yeah.
and I think Luke doesn't necessarily want to be in that seat of power either, because he's seen in The Mandalorian, you see him building his temple far away from any kind of heavily populated place, right next to the seat of power for the Emperor.
Yeah, but then you also see Luke perpetuating with Grogu, I think, some of what I would consider the more damaging tenets of the Order. This non-attachment, this you must dedicate everything to the Jedi Order, which left the Jedi Order rather untethered and vulnerable. But I guess we didn't have a lot of Jedi falls to the dark side either, and the one who did almost destroyed. So I guess you'll never know how effective the Jedi's tenets were, but it definitely does make a point of showing them as being stale and stagnant and not updating themselves or changing to match the nature, I don't want to say human nature, but of the nature of sentient beings. They were so limiting to Jedi that we had, I think, more of them fall than they expected. They were continually surprised by all the Jedi that fall. So let's make a list of fallen Jedi that we know about.
Oh goodness! Well, we have Anakin, we have Dooku.
So let's go in a little. So Anakin fell from attachment to his wife.
Yep.
We have Dooku.
And you could argue his mother, because I don't know if you can kill an entire tribe of sand people, Tusken Raiders, without being considered dark at that point.
Yeah, so we have
gray, toasted.
And normally perhaps the Jedi would have found out that he committed this deed and either helped him heal from it or brought him to justice.
Oh, they would have kicked him out right away. Yeah. Well,
at that point, Mace Windu would have insisted. Yeah. But they probably, he would have not been in a position of power. But then the Clone Wars started, he becomes a general. And then he starts getting involved in more death and more destruction. And so that's obviously wearing on him. We see in the Clone Wars series how that by the time the Revenge of the Sith rolls around, he is just hanging by a thread already, but no one sees it because the war, it looks like post-traumatic stress disorder, which it obviously is. But, a Jedi with post-traumatic stress disorder is dangerous. So that's Anakin is probably our most example. Then we have Dooku, who, like Anakin, had a slow fall. And this is primarily gone into they're going to, I think, adapt parts of it into a forthcoming series, Tales of the Jedi, which may come out by the time you listen to this. But there is an audio drama called Jedi Lost about Dooku's early life, narrated by Ventress, as she looks at his journal from when he was a Jedi. And, where Dooku is a fairly traditional Jedi, but then as a youngling, he is on a trip to Sereno, his home planet, and makes contact with his sister, and he recognizes her through the Force. His father, of course, is furious because he hates the Jedi he has separatist loyalties already and sees the Jedi as tools of the Republic. And so kicks him out, but his sister sneaks in the communicator. And so he maintains a contact with her until he's almost a Jedi Knight. And then it's discovered and he's disciplined, but they keep him in the Order. But one of his mentors in the Jedi Order is also engaged in some, I think, fringe practices, and they hide them from the whole Jedi Order. And then when he's a full Jedi Knight on a mission, he then encounters a dark side witch who attempts to kill him, and Dooku, in response, kills her with Force lightning that he did not even know he could do, taps into this dark side well that the witch was attempting to do, or that may or may not be part of his Serenian heritage, too. And then we see, through that, he becomes a Jedi Master, he mentors Qui-Gon Jinn, but he's hiding things from the Jedi Order this whole time. And by the time he falls, he just leaves the Jedi Order, and don't necessarily think he's a Sith, he'd become a political leader on his home planet of Sereno, but at that point, he's already secretly... at that point, he is vulnerable to Palpatine's manipulations and takes on the mantle of Darth Tyrannus not that long after.
Yeah, he reclaims that title. He reclaims that status of Count, which I always thought was important because he's not just General or whatever. He's Count Dooku, and it's not just because he's played by Christopher Lee, who's Count Dracula, and they wanted to pay homage. It has real universe significance.
Yeah, he's the leader of a whole planet and then becomes like the head of state for the Separatists. The Clone Wars makes it very clear that he is a powerful political leader and a secret Sith.
We move forward, just to look ahead at Ben Solo, and he similarly has these ambitions that are tied to family, where he wants to live up to the lineage of his past. He wants to be a terrifying figure like Darth Vader, and hopefully we'll get to a point where we get to learn why he made those decisions. I'm sure, I think there's a comic book out there that dove a little bit into some Ben and Luke hijinks during their apprenticeship, mastership. But
haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, but just, we can see through what his desires are and how he presents himself. He's trying to live up to this attachment to the past. He wants to be this horrifying villain, this horrifying visage.
Let's get back to Kylo Ren when we're talking about the Knights of Ren.
Yeah.
But you could consider him a fallen Jedi as well. And then just to quickly go through some other fallen Jedi.
Yeah, in the Clone Wars especially, there's Barriss, there's Pong Krell.
Barriss Offee, who's a Padawan who fights in the war alongside her master Luminara. At points almost killed and becomes to be disillusioned. And I think in a deliberate homage to anti-war protesters in real life, blows up a shuttle and kills some people. And she's a child soldier, basically. And, she even begs for help. And Anakin Skywalker just defeats her in battle and she's imprisoned.
Yeah. Thinking about it, Ahsoka Tano is an individual who left the Jedi Order, didn't turn to the dark side. But similarly grown jaded from the fact that they have become these warriors, these tools, these soldiers that have hypocritical views. And we're just so close to just dismissing her from the Jedi Order and not having any faith placed in her.
Well, I mean, they were going to potentially execute her until they figured out it was not her that was behind the terrorist attack. And so she certainly left the Jedi Order. And I think that's why they're doing this Tales of the Jedi series with Dooku, is because there are two Jedi who leave the Order, make the choice to leave themselves, and then end up in different places. Where Ahsoka never calls herself a Jedi again, though she doesn't correct people who refer to her that way.
She's an active Force practitioner of some kind, whether you call that a gray Jedi or what. There are parallels in what Luke was communicating in The Last Jedi, where he's saying that the Force is not light or dark, it's both, and it's not something that the Jedi own. It's this literal force of the galaxy.
Yeah, and then other fallen Jedi, Pong Krell, is a fairly straightforward. He was a general, and being in a position of power ended up letting him live out his worst desires, and that he held life and death in his hands and sent many of his clone troopers to their deaths. There's Terran Malicos, who is one of the antagonists in Fallen Order, who is a Jedi who survived Order 66 crashing on Dathomir and was alone on the planet because there were very few survivors on Dathomir after Palpatine purged most of the Night Sisters on the planet. We'll get to them in a minute.
Yeah.
So we see all these fallen Jedi, and you got 10,000, and we already named like 6 or 7 offhand that fell to the dark side. And I'm wondering, is this a danger that all Jedi faced, or was this a particular stressful? And Quinlan Vos even fell to the dark side and then was welcomed back into the Jedi Order. I'm not sure they should have after some of the things that he did, but even a Jedi Master fell temporarily to the dark side and came back.
With what I know about the High Republic, there really is no hint at Sith or the dark side. So it seems like a time of ideal peace for, at least within the Jedi Order. They might be battling external conflicts. I believe some pirate force that's in the books now. But by and large, you don't hear about much dissension from the Order. Whereas in the Clone Wars, it is this pressure cooker that Palpatine was churning the whole time. Whether, actively through manipulating war, or, who knows what kind of dark force storm brewing he was doing in his cauldrons and his temples in order to stew things up for the dark side.
And a lot of the expanded universe does show he's operating in the background, collecting Sith relics and other dark side, suppressing knowledge of the Jedi. That's after he's Emperor, of course, but even before that.
I could definitely see a Robot Chicken episode where it's like American Pickers, but it's just Darth Vader and the Emperor going like
trying to find old Sith artifacts.
On the road.
Yes, they're throwing out like a speeder, old speeder parts and all that. It's like, Darth Revan's lightsaber. Totally was not planted there by the producer.
And just lightnings the owner and runs.
Yeah. I think that's enough on the Jedi. But I think in conclusion about them, I would say is that while their philosophy worked for them in the time of peace, when it came under this pressure cooker, it left them vulnerable to people not having the tools necessary to survive a less cut and dried, peaceful time. And it left many Jedi woefully unprepared for violence, for war, and for not having a very, black and white view of the world. Ahsoka left and was happier not being a Jedi, but she could have gone down the road of Barris Offee or Pong Krell had she made a few different choices.
Mm-hmm.
And she's even offered to join the Inquisitors by an Inquisitor. She rejects the demand and kills the Inquisitor, but it's always there. And Cal Kestis is always tempted even to fall to go to the dark side. Because, again, his training did not prepare him, and the Jedi were not prepared for the threat of the Sith.
I wanted to mention Rey because she is the future of the Jedi. Mm-hmm. And I think about Luke, and I think about, it's a shame that we didn't get to see his order. But at the same time, it is indicative of trying to plow ahead with the same set of rules, the same sort of ideals without any kind of change. It's going to lead to the same exact outcome. And it literally did, because it involves Palpatine, and the less the set on the Rise of Skywalker, the better.
Yeah, but so I think Luke lionized the old Jedi Order to a degree, despite Ahsoka's warnings, because we actually see her sort of being a mentor to him in The Mandalorian, but not joining his Jedi Order. Mm-hmm. And I think he proceeds with, and we do see him in the expanded universe seeking out other Force traditions, which is a good sign, which we'll see later. Mm-hmm. But I think when push comes to shove, he falls back on how the old Jedi of old used to do it because of the reverence he holds at least Obi-Wan in. Mm-hmm. And that is the kind of thinking that Yoda tries to break him out of at the end of The Last Jedi. It's
right.
Like, these Jedi, we knew some of the answers, but new knowledge is always coming forward, and you have to adapt to the times. And that is one reason he failed. And he took his failure so hard that he, instead of trying to do better again, he decided to stop trying. And it was only when he started trying again that he was able to pass on his knowledge to the generation of Rey. And I think Rey has far fewer hang-ups than... She fairly well embraces the use of the Force and has attachments with friends. We don't get any sense of her romantic inclinations, but that's certainly not necessary for a character. I think it was necessary for Anakin Skywalker, who was a very intensely intimate and romantic person.
Yeah, whose passions led to his downfall, but...
Which we can contrast, which you'll see later in our episode on Star Wars and romance.
Yes.
So that I think that does cover the Jedi. Anything else you want to say about Rey, sort of the future?
I just hope that when we return to her, we don't find out that Finn's daughter killed Rey's order and is now the new Dark Empress of evil. Just give us a Jedi order that functions. It's time.
Or even if they call themselves something else.
The Skywalkers.
The Guardians, the Skywalkers, the Wills, whatever.
Yeah. Don't the Chiss call themselves Skywalkers?
They do. We'll get to that I guess we'll get to that in a minute, but it's one reason when Thrawn, Grand Admiral Thrawn, meets Anakin Skywalker during the Clone Wars, he is at first surprised by his name, because that is the Chiss word for their Force sensitives. Yeah.
So I think that would be a fair enough step moving on. I just want Star Wars to continue off from where it has been, because while they keep going back and celebrating Kenobi and The Mandalorian, it's great. But I think to shake loose the cobwebs, they need to take a step forward. But that's a topic for another day. Thank you so much for listening. We've been talking Star Wars. We'll see you sometime soon in a galaxy right here.